Welcome along to Obsession Engineering. One of my mates wants to go club racing and he's got some money to spend. So we bought a brand new RS660 and a lot of bling to go on it. And so I know we've built an RS660 before on the channel, but this one's going to be a little bit different. What we're going to do, pull this one apart, and as we're building it back into full race trim, we're going to show you some of the things we've learned over the last couple of years of RS660 knowledge. First job on the Aprilia is to take it apart. So this is going to be fairings off, which are already sold, SC Project's exhaust pipe off because it's the road version and that's already sold, to recoup some of the monies. And then we're going to do a full strip down on this one because the engine is coming out, because we're going to have the cylinder head off it because that's getting tuned, and we're having different calipers, different wheels, different fork internals, top yokes, handlebars, rear sets, and lots and lots and lots of bling in between. And so this is going to be really busy, but luckily I have some help on this job. Rob, you going to help?
You said the season had finished, Dave.
Oh, right. I'm going to give Rob some coffee, and then we're going to start taking this apart. To be fair, because me and Rob are not exactly on form at the moment, we might just put a time lapse on this and talk you through it in the edit. Taking the fairing off the Aprilia isn't too bad, but you will need every tool out your toolbox: Torx bits, screwdrivers, Allen keys, because just having one type of fastener would have been far too Japanese. We've had now a bit over an hour being quite productive, or in fact destructive, because that is a relatively stripped down RS660 and that is all the road kit that comes off it. Because obviously you've got your normal big side panels that you actually see, and then there's lots of infill trim bits, and some of this we're keeping, some of it the customer is selling or is already sold, but it does make quite a good pile, so later today I will go and get rid of that out of the workshop. A couple of little bits as we're pulling it apart that is worth noting. The rear brake light switch has to stay connected. It's a Euro compliance thing, and if you disconnect it, it puts a fault upon the dashboard, so we leave that connected. The tail light will have an eliminator in it, and so will the headlight, because if you don't put the eliminators in, again, it goes into fault code. And then as we go through the rest of the bike, there will be a delete for the pair valve, like the fresh air recirculation that goes into the exhaust port up there. That's going to get blanked off. And there's like a charcoal canister, which is part of the emission stuff, and that's getting blanked off as well. And the side stand switch is getting blanked, so we've got jet prime bits to do all of that. But the next thing we need to do is take the engine out of it. And on an RS660, that's quite intense because the engine holds the frame to the swinging arm. And so we're going to go and get a little frame that sits under the engine, and then we'll pull all the bits apart, but we can at least take the airbox, ECU, throttle bodies, and a few other bits off before we get to that stage. So as you can see, we've got most of the peripherals off the bike now. So airbox off, throttle bodies off, most of the wiring connections off, radiator, exhaust pipes, front sprocket off so you can hook the chain off it. Big thing when you're doing engine changing, make sure you've gone through twice and made sure you've disconnected all the electrical bits. Rob's taken the ABS pump module out because then it's easier to get to the earth connections and the starter motor connections and bits like that. Because it's really, really easy when you come to actually dropping the engine out of the frame to leave one wire connected. And then you have to repair a wiring loom. So as we were saying there, we've taken the ABS pump module out so that we can get to the starter motor connector, because otherwise it's an absolute pain. And it's also much easier to drop the engine out without the ABS lines running around here. And we don't need the ABS anymore anyway, so now that's off, that's definitely staying off. The next bit we're doing to make engine removal and refitting a bit easier is we've made these little engine cradle bits. I say we, a friend of mine, Robert, has made them. So that's going to bolt under there and like sit under the engine, and it just means we can put a scissor jack underneath and support the engine, and then with that supported we can undo the bolts that hold the swinging arm in, and we can take the swinging arm and back wheel out complete, making sure that we've got the brake line and the rear wheel speed sensor disconnected. All we're going to do then is literally undo the big bolt that hold the engine to the main frame and lift the frame off the engine. We might make it sound quite simple. Undo the swinging arm, remove it from the engine. Undo the frame, lift it off the top. It isn't difficult, but I would thoroughly suggest having at least one extra pair of hands. So what started off as a complete RS660 on the bench is now just an engine. I mean, there's lots of bits strewn around, but that's the bit we're really interested in right now. So we're going to put that on the bench, and we're going to take the cylinder head off it. So work on the Aprilia is going pretty well, but that doesn't mean that we shouldn't still stop for a great British tradition. Tea break. Now, tea break is important, not just so you can get a lovely cup of tea, but also it gives you a bit of time to think about what you're doing and think of the next step in the job. So I would always recommend having a tea break. But I'm going to throw out a revelation. I'm not a tea drinker. I've never really got into the hot tea thing. Tea, coffee, they're just not really for me. But I have found something that's better. I could just drink a glass of water, but it's not the most exciting thing going. But luckily, the lovely folks at Holy have got involved with me, and they've given me something better, and I have been drinking it for a while now, and I've just been sent a new flavour. So I've talked about Holy before, and they have a couple of new flavours for their energy drinks. But some days, I don't even need the caffeine, but what I want is a drink that's going to give me a little bit more than water. So I've been drinking the iced tea. So I've been drinking this sort of instead of squash and cordial and stuff because it's better, basically. Because it's got an actual tea base, you get the antioxidants and the superfood sort of nature of the tea, and you get the flavourings of proper fruit juice, proper fruit elements and bits in it, and they've done a good job with this. There is less than half a gram of sugar in a scoop, which means you get like less than 20 calories in half a litre of this. So if you don't know what flavour you might like out of the many lovely flavours they have, you can go online and get the starter pack. But one little scoop, and it is only a little scoop, and half a litre of water, and that means the pack lasts ages. It's actually good value as well. It makes it about 80p a drink. And so I've got goodness, I'm not spending a fortune. Surely this is much better than your traditional iced teas and things. And that's the first time I've had this. This is the double apple and shisha tea, and that is really, really nice. I keep messing up the next line, so this is about the fourth take, and the nice thing is I've actually enjoyed drinking this. If you would like to join me on the Holy journey, I'll put a link in the corner, whichever corner it is, and a link in the description with a discount code to get you started with the Holy stuff. It's really nice, it's good for you. Why wouldn't you want it? So the tuned cylinder head and the fast cams are in the RS660 engine, but there are a couple of little bits extra to do before we put it back in the bike. So the first thing we're going to do is going to affect some polar bears. But then polar bears will eat people, so I think we're better off without them. Controversial, I know, but I'm going with it. And it also involves a bit of bling. Basically, we're getting rid of the pair valve fitting on the front of the cylinder head. So what this does in normal operation is it lets fresh air or clean air from the airbox into the exhaust ports. So with the throttle shut at low RPM, when there's like a bit of a vacuum in the exhaust, there's little reed valves in here and a solenoid opens a pipe up and lets fresh air into the exhaust pipes, which helps burn any unburnt fuel. It's all very sensible, but we don't want it. And on the dyno it can alter your readings a little bit, so we're better off without it. So what we're going to do is take this plate off with the pipe hole in it, and we're going to fit this jet prime blank instead, and then there's a solenoid blank in there as well, so that the bike thinks it's still connected and behaves like normal. And as promised, there is one more thing to do on the engine before we're going to refit it, and that is under here. So I better take the sump off and show you. Inside the sump we have the oil straightener that you pick up for the oil, and just here we have the oil pressure relief valve, which controls how much pressure the oil system generates. Basically at tick over, the oil pump's not spinning very fast, so it doesn't create masses of oil pressure. At high RPM, the oil pump spins much faster, so you get much more oil flow, and because the orifices are only a certain size, that increases the pressure. And so you have an oil pressure relief valve, so your oil system doesn't go over pressure. on earlier 660 engines, that could fall out. And that then wrecks your engine because there's no oil supply to anything, but your oil pump is still running, just doesn't actually feed oil to anything. So this never used to be secured with anything. It was screwed in, torqued up, but there was no Loctite or anything on the thread, and there wasn't this extra little bit of plastic on the oil strainer that stops it falling out. Now, because this is a later one, this will be Loctited in, because I've had one out before to check it, and as you can see here, if it moves a few millimetres, it hits the oil strainer, and then it can't unscrew any further anyway. So that is perfectly secure, so we don't need to do anything to it. But it was worth checking, because it's a safety item, and if you have an earlier bike, what we tended to do was mark this shroud, take the valve out, drill through the shroud, which is quite hard because it's steel, drill through that and lock wire that straight to this oil way under here. So you can tuck it just behind the oil strainer, and you might have to take a little trim out the gasket here, but doing that means the oil pressure relief valve can't fall out and your engine's going to be a lot safer. Now I'm happy that my oil pressure relief valve definitely can't fall out. I've put the sump back on and I've turned my 2 jobs on the engine into 3 because I've changed the standard sump plug for this Pro Bolt drilled titanium one. The advantage of this is the holes are already drilled in it, so it makes it much easier to lock wire. The standard ones are very flat, so you can drill them, but they're a bit of a pain, to be honest. And I've also lock wired it. So when lock wiring, the lock wire wants to be pulling the bolt tight. So the bolt would be turning this way to tighten, so I want the lock wire to pull it that way, and I've just drilled a little hole in one of the ridges on the sump, pulled the lock wire through, and then when I finish lock wiring, I've turned the end in, so if I'm picking the engine up later, I can't trap that in my finger and stab myself. If you lock wire to, say, this hole down here, then the bolt could actually come undone by half a turn before the lock wire stopped it. And so by then you would have oil leaking out of your sump. And so the bolt always has to be getting pulled tight by the lock wire. So at the moment the bolt can't come even a fraction loose because the lock wire is already tight. So on this engine it was nice and easy to just drill a little hole in the sump to pull the lock wire tight. If you don't have anywhere accessible but you've got a bolt hole, what you can do is buy an Obsession Engineering laser cut bracket. So that would go in my bolt hole, hold it in place with an M6 bolt, and then you could lock wire into the little tab. These are on the website at obsessionengineering.co.uk. They're really, really handy little things, and a lot of the time they can just make the job a little bit easier. While I'm tinkering, I've thought of something else. This little breather, this is actually the crankcase breather. These little screws, eventually they actually pack down slightly because the gasket behind them sort of basically beds in. And so what I'm going to do while I get the chance is just whip them out, put a little dab of Loctite on them, screw them down and give them a good nip up so that even if the gasket packs down, the bolts can't go loose and fall out. Loctited all the bolts on the breather, and then remembered I can actually just drill a couple of holes in the oil filler cap, and I've put one in this little bracket that holds the breather in place, so I can lock wire that, but there's no point actually putting the lock wire on yet because I'll need to put some oil in it. But I have lock wired the filler. So oil filters, you can buy oil filters with a little like hex on the front that you can lock wire to. I've seen them before where the spot welds that hold the hex on leak, so I don't like those. So what I prefer to do is put a Jubilee clip around, and then you can feed the lock wire sort of down the side of the thread bit of the lock of the Jubilee clip, and then lock wire it to something practical. Because I've got water pipes in a convenient location, I've just lock wired to the water pipe. Nice trick with the Jubilee clip is you can have the Jubilee clip sort of round here a few mil, lock wire it all up, nip it, and then if you slacken the Jubilee clip off and push it round, it tensions the Jubilee clip, tensions the lock wire up. So I've got nice tight lock wire there, oil filter's done. So now the engine is actually ready to go back in the bike. Putting the engine back in is pretty much the reverse of the removal process. But with the frame on, the swinging arm can bolt onto the back of the engine, and happy days, it looks like a bike again. I didn't see the point in putting the engine back in and refitting the old rear sets, because when you fit the plates that hold the engine and frame to the swinging arm pivot goes through the rear sets. And so I fitted the mounting blocks for the Spider rear sets that are going on. It makes life a little bit easier because later to take the swinging arm pivot out just adds a bit of complication to the job. So bolted the brackets on while we're here, that's one bit out of the way. And I've also bolted the K-Tech shock in. Before I fitted it, I checked the settings in it so I know exactly where the shock is set. That is bolted in the bike. Another little job done. And next on the agenda is to refit all the electrical connectors. So I've got to reconnect coils, I'll have to put the throttle bodies on and put the injectors on, and earth wires and that sort of stuff. But I do also need to wire in the power commander while we're there, and that needs connecting into some of the wires down here, so I may as well go and get it out of the box, get that ready. When I built my bike, we put a rapid bike unit on, because on paper, the rapid bike unit can fuel off the lander, can do ignition mapping, does the fueling. It's a bit cleverer. Unfortunately, in practice, what it did was make the throttle connection really bad on the bike, because any time you interrupted the throttle, the ignition signal, the ECU had a bit of a heart attack. And so at TT a couple of years ago, we actually took it off and put a power commander on. So this, the Power Commander 6 and the 5 that came before it, they're maybe not quite as clever as the rapid bike modules, but they are more reliable, and we've had perfectly good results tuning the bike with these, and so that's what we're fitting, because it's just a bit easier to use and a bit more reliable. So the module itself sits on top of the battery towards the back of the bike, and then there's a connection into the battery, and then there is a selection of wires. So that is the crank signal, so it knows what RPM the bike is doing. You've got these that go to the throttle bodies, so it knows what the throttle openings are, and these are the connections that go to the injectors so that it can actually change the fueling signal. So as I connect the wiring loom bits up into the bike, I'll also connect these connectors up and tuck the wiring out of the way so that it's nice and neat. Throttle bodies are on, airbox is on, and I've fitted the big Jet Prime bell mouths. On the tuned engines especially, these definitely help. Get a bit more airflow in, and on our bike, back to back on the dyno, a distinct advantage over the standard bell mouths. There is a little metal bracket that sits off the airbox down the gap, and that is originally for holding the solenoid for the charcoal canister for the emissions stuff. But what I've done, instead of removing the bracket, is I've actually used it to hold the key holder, because this bike's just going to have a push button start. Like the key holder and the immobiliser antenna is connected to it, and so is the removal, like the eliminator for the solenoid for the pair valve for the charcoal canister. So there is a bracket, it could have been removed, but actually it's in there and it's being used, and that's just going to stop the wiring moving around and fretting. So next stage, air filter and airbox top. And we're not using the standard air filter. We've got an MWR World Superbike spec air filter. This is the same one we've been using on my bike, and that, along with the Gabbro air scoop we'll fit later, has a definite advantage getting air into the engine. Right, and that is airbox done, so at least the top end of the engine is sealed up, nothing getting that way. So that is happy days, but there is still plenty more to do, including getting some bits down in here. And now the ECU is refitted as well, but that hides some of the work that goes on underneath. There's quite a lot of wiring that runs down underneath the ECU and along the other side of it. And it's worth spending a little bit of extra time making sure your wiring is tucked away, cable tied in place, nice and secure, so that it doesn't fret. Because if your wiring's just sort of dangling around, as the bike vibrates and as you ride it, the wiring can easily rub on the engine block or on anything else, and if that rubs through, you're going to get into trouble, and finding wiring faults on modern bikes is an absolute pain, and so it is definitely worth spending a bit of extra time making sure your wiring is tucked away nicely. We'll worry about that one later, and that'll have a proper bracket. We'll get to those bits. After getting all the wiring and bits tucked out of the way, I have forged ahead and fitted some relatively straightforward bits that I didn't really feel the need to go into mega detail. GB engine covers. We run these on the Superbike. They are strong, they crash really well. They're in fact that tough that when I fitted the gear shift support, and basically this has a little bearing behind here, and when you're trying to shift, instead of the shift rod trying to twist slightly, you get a much more positive gear change. And so when I come to fit that, it goes to the same bolt hole position as the GB cover. But the two didn't quite fit together, and I wanted the cover to fit flush without it being spaced out, and so I had to cut a section out of it. And I thought, it'll be easy, it's basically plastic, I'll just get a Dremel with a grinding wheel on it. Yeah, that didn't work. That is tough stuff for abrasion, and so I ended up actually link drilling the section out and then getting a milling piece in to tickle it out. So they are considerably sturdier than you expect. Then after that I decided it was time to actually put the rear sets on. And a couple of important points when you're putting rear sets on. Things like foot pegs, yes, there might be multiple positions they can go in, but when your foot's on them, it is of course your foot's moving all the time and rubbing them forward and backwards. It's really easy for foot pegs to come undone. So I always Loctite the bolt that holds the foot peg on, because you don't want your foot pegs falling off. In fact, I actually Loctite the bolts for everything that you don't want to come undone, which is pretty much everything on a footrest assembly. Especially somewhere like this on the pivot, if the bearing starts dragging slightly, every time you change gear it's trying to loosen the bolt, and so always Loctite that, basically Loctite everything that you don't want to even have a remote chance of coming undone. The other important thing when you're setting your gear change up is try and get your pivot at 90 degrees, so that when it's pulling that way, you get the same force applied as if it's pushing that way. If this was up here and the angle was really tight, when you're trying to turn the shaft that way, it's going to try and push the shaft away as opposed to actually twisting it. So 90 degrees, as close to it as you can get, you will get a better gear change. And around this side, there's no back brake because this bike isn't having a foot brake on it. And so that has made that considerably easier to fit. And the last bit on foot peg positioning, because I've raced one of these bikes quite a bit, I find the bike works best with the shock quite short, because the bike actually sits quite tall, and so when you brake you get quite a lot of pitching on it, and so I preferred the bike with the shock run short, so in effect the bike's running lower. That means you get less ride height, which means I run the foot pegs in a high position, just gives you that little bit more ground clearance, and the foot peg to seat position is still quite generous, and so even in the high position there's actually quite a lot of space on these 660s. Okay, I'll admit it. I should have fitted the chain guard when we had the swinging arm out the bike, because I could have turned everything upside down. It would have been a lot easier to drill it, but still, I've drilled it from underneath. That is mounted nice and solidly. Chain guards have a real tendency to vibrate off, so make sure you've got Loctite holding the bolts in on that and everything's tight. Also change the somewhat cheaper paddock stand bobbins for the nice GB racing ones. They look a bit nicer, and the nice thing is they actually twist a little bit, so when you put the paddock stand in it doesn't try and loosen the bolt. Right. Swinging arm cover, it normally has a chain guard sticking off it. Then when you come to take the wheel out, you've got nowhere to hook the chain over the swinging arm because it's in the way. And so we've dremelled that off, cleaned it up. Jolly's Carbon do a really nice pre-preg carbon swinging arm cover and hugger, amongst other nice things for Aprilias. They're not going on this project yet. We might talk a man into that later, but for now we're sticking with the plastic ones, and that's it. A good chunk of work done. So we've made some solid progress now on the Fast RS660, but there is plenty more to do. So I hope you've enjoyed this instalment, and please join me again soon for some more motorbike fun.